Salut to the monde and welcome to today's deep dive. We're tackling a topic that I know a lot of you are curious about, the link between stress and weight gain. We've got some fascinating medical research to unpack, and trust me, it's way more complicated than you might think. So get ready to bust some myths and uncover the real science behind this sometimes baffling relationship.
Yeah, it's fascinating because while many people assume that stress automatically equals packing on the pounds, the reality is far more nuanced. Back in 1936, Hans Selye, a pioneer in stress research, defined stress as the body's non-specific response to any demand placed upon it. Think about the famous fight-or-flight response, first described by W. Buchanan and later expanded upon by H. Labourette. Our bodies are hardwired to react to stress-releasing hormones like adrenaline and cortisol to help us cope with challenging situations.
Okay, so we've got this primal response system kicking in when we're stressed. But how does that actually translate to weight gain? Is it as simple as just reaching for a bag of chips when deadlines are looming?
Oh, it's definitely not that straightforward. The relationship between stress and weight depends on a whole bunch of factors. The type of stress, its duration, individual differences like personality and genetics, even learned behaviors. For example, some people under intense stress can actually lose weight due to the activation of something called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or HPA axis, and the appetite-suppressing effects of a hormone called CRF. It's counterintuitive, but it happens.
Oh, wow. So stress can actually lead to weight loss in some cases. It's definitely not what most people would expect to hear.
Exactly. It highlights the complexity of this issue. And on the flip side, we also see cases where individuals experience significant weight gain after major psychological trauma, like sexual assault. This is thought to be a psychological coping mechanism, a way of creating a physical barrier or altering one's appearance as a form of self-protection.
That's a really interesting perspective. It makes you realize that weight gain isn't always about overeating or lack of willpower. There can be deeper psychological factors at play.
Absolutely. And when we look at moderate chronic stress, the picture becomes even more intricate. This kind of stress, like constant pressure at work or relationship difficulties, can actually increase food intake in some individuals, particularly cravings for high-fat or high-carbohydrate comfort foods, even when they're not physically hungry.
So it seems like there's this constant push and pull between stress, our hormones, and our eating habits.
Precisely. And here's where things get really interesting. Pre-existing dietary restrictions can actually amplify the impact of stress on eating. When someone's already restricting their food intake, stress can trigger intense cravings and lead to overeating later on. This is especially relevant for people struggling with obesity, where restriction itself becomes a stressor. It's a vicious cycle.
That makes so much sense. You're already feeling deprived, and then stress adds fuel to the fire, making those cravings even harder to resist. It's like setting yourself up for a battle you can't win.
You hit the nail on the head. And to understand why this happens, we need to delve into the fascinating world of hormones.
Okay, so let's break down this hormonal havoc. What's going on in our bodies when stress and food collide?
Well, one key player is neuropeptide Y, or NPY for short. This powerful hormone stimulates appetite and has anxiety-reducing effects. But here's the catch. NPY also promotes angiogenesis. The formation of new blood vessels in adipose tissue encourages the accumulation of certain immune cells called macrophages, and even stimulates the proliferation and differentiation of fat cells. Basically, it primes our bodies for fat storage.
Wow, that's a pretty potent combination.
Yeah.
So stress triggers NPY, and NPY encourages our bodies to hold on to fat. So if I'm understanding this correctly, when we're stressed, NPY not only makes us crave those comfort foods, but it also preps our bodies to store that fat more efficiently. We're really getting hit from both sides.
Precisely. And this isn't just theoretical. In one study, researchers found that stressed mice only gained weight when they were fed a high-calorie, high-carbohydrate diet. Blocking NPY receptors actually prevented this stress-induced weight gain.
So it's not just the stress itself that's the culprit, but also the types of food we're reaching for when we're stressed. Definitely makes you think twice before grabbing that donut when you're feeling overwhelmed.
It definitely highlights the importance of mindful eating, especially during times of stress. But NPY is just one piece of the puzzle. Cortisol, the infamous stress hormone, also plays a major role.
Cortisol. Cortisol to hate. Where does cortisol fit into all of this? Is it a friend or foe when it comes to managing our weight?
You're right. Cortisol can be a bit of a troublemaker when it comes to weight gain. Researchers have known for a long time that glucocorticoids, a class of hormones that includes cortisol, can actually restore obesity in patients whose adrenal glands have been removed.
Yeah.
This shows just how powerful these hormones are in regulating our weight.
It does. And the interplay between NPY and cortisol, well, that's where things get really fascinating. Studies in rats have shown that when you administer dexamethasone, a synthetic glucocorticoid that mimics the effects of cortisol, directly into the brain, it triggers this whole cascade of events that leads to overeating and metabolic disruption. Hold on, that's a lot to unpack. So basically, dexamethasone, which mimics the effects of cortisol, sets off this chain reaction in the brain that leads to overeating and metabolic mayhem.
You got it. And guess what? When researchers administered NPY directly into the brain, it had similar effects except in animals whose adrenal glands had been removed. This demonstrates that the HPA axis, which controls cortisol production, is a crucial piece of this puzzle.
It's amazing how interconnected everything is. The brain, hormones, stress, food, it's like this delicate dance, and when one partner steps out of line, the whole choreography falls apart. We've talked a lot about the science, but I'd love to see how all of this plays out in people's lives. The medical text you brought in mentions clinical observations, right?
Absolutely. It starts by acknowledging something that many of us have probably experienced, this tendency to link weight gain to stressful events in our lives. Like going through a breakup or losing a job and suddenly our clothes feel a bit tighter. However, the text points out that it can be tricky to establish a clear timeline between stress and weight gain.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Life is messy, and there are always multiple factors at play. It's not like there's a simple equation where stress equals X pounds gained.
Exactly. Sometimes excess weight itself can lead to anxiety and depression, which can then fuel a cycle of inactivity and unhealthy eating habits. It becomes a chicken or the egg scenario where it's hard to disentangle cause and effect.
That's such an important point.
Yeah.
We tend to think of stress as the culprit, but sometimes it's the weight gain itself that's contributing to the stress.
Absolutely. And the text highlights a few specific examples that illustrate the complexity of this relationship. One study looked at parents of children with cancer and found that they tended to gain more weight in the months following their child's diagnosis compared to parents of healthy children.
That's heartbreaking. It's understandable that parents would experience immense stress during such a difficult time.
Of course. And while the study couldn't definitively prove a causal link between the stress of diagnosis and the weight gain, the researchers did find that parents of children with cancer reported decreased physical activity and some changes in their eating habits. So it's likely that these lifestyle factors played a role.
It's a good reminder that stress can impact our behaviors in ways we might not even be aware of, from our activity levels to the types of foods we choose.
Precisely. And then there are cases of massive rapid weight gain following major psychological trauma like sexual assault. The text describes this as a kind of psychological response, a way of coping with the trauma and protecting oneself. It's incredibly complex, and the weight gain often seems disproportionate to any reported changes in eating.
That's a powerful example of how weight gain can be so much more than just calories in, calories out. There are deeper psychological and emotional factors at play that we need to acknowledge. We've talked a lot about hormones, but we can't ignore the emotional aspect of eating, especially when we're stressed. What about comfort food? Is that just a thing, or is there a real physiological explanation behind those cravings for chips and cookies when we're feeling overwhelmed?
It's definitely not just a thing. The text acknowledges the phenomenon of emotional eating, but it points out that stress doesn't have a uniform impact on everyone's eating habits.
So some people eat more when they're stressed, while others eat less. We talked earlier about how intense acute stress can actually suppress appetite.
Exactly. But when it comes to moderate chronic stress, the text highlights this fascinating push and pull. It explains that this kind of stress can increase food intake, particularly of those high-fat, high-carbohydrate comfort foods, even in individuals who are already full.
It's like stress hijacks our brain's reward system, making us crave those sugary, fatty treats even when we don't physically need them.
That's a great way to put it. And remember that interplay between stress and pre-existing dietary restrictions we discussed earlier.
Oh, yeah. You said that restriction can actually backfire and lead to increased food intake later on.
Precisely. The text delves deeper into this concept, explaining that restriction often creates this cycle of deprivation and overeating, especially for individuals struggling with obesity. It introduces the term cognitive restriction syndrome, which describes how focusing on restricting food intake can actually fuel disordered eating behaviors.
It's like the more we try to control what we eat, the more out of control our eating habits become.
That's the paradox of restriction. It creates this constant mental battle that can be incredibly draining and ultimately counterproductive.
This is so eye-opening. It really challenges the traditional calories in, calories out approach to weight loss.
It does, and it highlights the importance of addressing the psychological and emotional aspects of our relationship with food, especially when it comes to managing stress and weight.
This deep dive has been a whirlwind of information. We've covered so much ground, from the basic definition of stress to the intricate interplay of hormones, enzymes, and even psychological factors. It's incredible how much research has gone into this topic.
It is, and we've only just scratched the surface. There's still so much to learn about the intricate connections between stress, our bodies, and our behaviors. The text goes into more detail about the hormonal mechanisms involved in stress-related weight gain, particularly the roles of NPY and cortisol.
Okay, let's circle back to those hormonal heavy hitters. I'm ready for round two.
All right, so remember neuropeptide Y, or NPY, and its role in stimulating appetite and promoting fat storage.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
That's the hormone that primes our bodies to pack on the pounds, especially when we're stressed and reaching for those calorie-rich comfort foods.
Exactly. Well, the text delves into the fascinating mechanics of NPY, like how it actually works its magic, or should we say its mischief.
I'm all ears. How does NPY orchestrate this whole fat storage symphony in our bodies?
Well, it turns out that NPY doesn't just increase appetite, it also stimulates angiogenesis, the formation of new blood vessels in adipose tissue or fat tissue.
So NPY encourages blood vessel growth in our fat. Why is that important?
It's all about creating a more efficient delivery system for storing fat. More blood vessels mean more nutrients, and energy can reach those fat cells, allowing them to plump up and multiply.
It's like building a super highway straight to our fat stores.
That's a great analogy,
Mhm.
and it doesn't stop there. NPY also promotes the infiltration of macrophages into adipose tissue.
Now, I remember from our past deep dives that macrophages are immune cells, but what are they doing hanging out in our fat?
That's a fascinating area of research. It seems that macrophages play a role in inflammation, which is increasingly recognized as a key player in obesity and metabolic disease.
So NPY is indirectly contributing to inflammation in our fat through these macrophages.
That's the current thinking. And to make things even more complex, NPY also stimulates the proliferation and differentiation of fat cells themselves.
So it's not just about making existing fat cells bigger, but also creating brand new ones. NPY is really going all out.
It is. And the text highlights a specific study in mice that really drives this point home. Researchers found that stressed mice only gained weight when they were fed a high-calorie, high-carbohydrate diet. When they blocked NPY receptors in these mice, it prevented the stress-induced weight gain.
That's a powerful demonstration of how NPY is involved in this intricate interplay between stress, diet, and weight gain. It seems like NPY is a pretty major character in this play.
Ugh.
But I feel like we were talking about another important hormone earlier, cortisol. What does the text tell us about its role in weight gain?
The text emphasizes that researchers have known for a long time that glucocorticoids, the class of hormones that includes cortisol, can restore obesity in patients whose adrenal glands have been removed. This highlights just how profound of an impact these hormones have on weight regulation.
So even without the adrenal glands producing cortisol, these hormones can still exert their influence on weight. That's fascinating.
It is. And the relationship between NPY and cortisol, well, that's where things get really intriguing. Studies in rats have shown that when you administer dexamethasone, a synthetic glucocorticoid that mimics the effects of cortisol directly into the brain, it triggers this whole cascade of events that leads to overeating and metabolic disruptions.
Could you remind me what those events are? It's a lot to keep track of.
I hear you. It's a complex web of interactions. Basically, dexamethasone triggers overeating, excess insulin production, insulin resistance, and increased NPY levels in a specific area of the hypothalamus, the part of the brain that plays a key role in regulating appetite and metabolism.
So dexamethasone, by mimicking cortisol, sets the stage for weight gain by messing with appetite control, interfering with insulin signaling, and boosting those NPY levels.
Exactly. And what's even more amazing is that when researchers administered NPY directly into the brain, it had similar effects except in animals whose adrenal glands had been removed.
That shows that the HPA axis, which controls cortisol production, is a crucial link in this chain reaction.
Precisely. It's a beautiful illustration of how interconnected our hormonal systems are and how disruptions in one system can have ripple effects throughout the body. The text highlights the groundbreaking work of researchers P. Bjorntorp and R. Rosman, who made significant contributions to our understanding of the stress-weight gain connection.
Interesting. What did they find out about cortisol?
Well, their work was instrumental in demonstrating how stress, through elevated cortisol levels, can drive the accumulation of visceral fat, the kind of fat that surrounds our internal organs and is linked to increased health risks. Essentially, cortisol throws our appetite regulation system out of whack, making it much harder to maintain a healthy weight.
So how does cortisol wreak havoc on our appetite control?
It acts on several fronts. First, it stimulates the NPY system, which we already know increases appetite and promotes fat storage.
So cortisol gives NPY a boost, amplifying its fat-storing effects.
Exactly. At the same time, cortisol blocks the leptin system. Leptin is a hormone that normally helps regulate our food intake and energy expenditure, signaling to our brain when we're full and have enough energy stores.
So cortisol basically silences the signals that tell us to stop eating. That's like a recipe for disaster.
It is. And to make matters worse, cortisol also lowers levels of corticotropin-releasing hormone, or CRH, further disrupting the delicate balance of appetite regulation.
It seems like cortisol is pulling out all the stops to make us overeat and store fat when we're stressed.
It's a powerful survival mechanism that served our ancestors well in times of famine or danger, ensuring they had enough energy reserves to survive. But in our modern world, where food is plentiful and stress is often chronic, this ancient system can backfire, leading to weight gain and health problems.
It's a classic example of a mismatch between our biology and our environment.
Exactly. And remember we talked about how visceral fat has a high concentration of glucocorticoid receptors? Well, this means that high cortisol levels further promote fat accumulation in this area, creating a vicious cycle that can be hard to break.
So high cortisol levels lead to abdominal fat storage, which in turn makes us more sensitive to the effects of cortisol. Talk about a vicious cycle.
You got it. But here's an interesting twist. The text points out that it's not just the overall amount of cortisol circulating in our blood that matters.
Wait, there's more to the cortisol story. I thought we were finally starting to get a handle on things.
I know, right? It's a fascinating field of research. It turns out that cortisol levels in specific tissues like fat cells are regulated by two enzymes, 11-hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase type 1, 11-HSD1, and 11-HSD2.
Let's back up for a second. What are these enzymes and why are they important?
Think of them as volume knobs for cortisol, controlling how much active cortisol is present in our fat cells. 11-HSD1 regenerates cortisol from a less active form called cortisone, while 11-HSD2 does the opposite, converting cortisol to cortisone.
So they're basically controlling how much active cortisol is available to do its thing in different tissues.
Exactly. And research suggests that increased 11-HSD1 activity, which can be influenced by genetics, environmental factors, and even epigenetic modifications, leads to higher cortisol levels, specifically in abdominal fat.
So even if your overall cortisol levels aren't sky high, you could still have increased cortisol activity in your belly fat if 11-HSD1 is working overtime.
Precisely. And this localized increase in cortisol activity can further promote fat storage and inflammation in that area. It's a fascinating example of how subtle variations in enzyme activity can have significant downstream effects on our health.
This deep dive into the science of stress and weight gain has been incredible. We've covered so much ground, from the basic definition of stress to the intricate dance of hormones and enzymes that orchestrate this relationship.
And we've explored how stress can manifest in different ways, from emotional eating to changes in physical activity, ultimately impacting our weight and overall well-being.
But I think the most important takeaway is that we're not powerless in the face of stress. There are steps we can take to manage stress, cultivate healthier habits, and ultimately regain control of our weight and well-being.
Absolutely. And to wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final thought. Knowing what you now know about the profound impact of stress on our bodies, what small changes can you make today to manage your stress levels and potentially improve your health?
That's a great question to ponder. It could be as simple as taking a few minutes each day for mindful breathing, incorporating more movement into your routine, or prioritizing quality sleep.
Every little step counts. And remember, you're not alone in this journey. There are resources available, from support groups to stress management programs, to help you navigate the challenges and cultivate a healthier, more balanced life.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you gained some valuable insights into the fascinating and complex world of stress and weight gain.
It was a pleasure exploring this topic with you. Until next time, take care and remember to prioritize your well-being.